It looks like we're going to go ahead and get started. We just want to welcome everybody and want to thank Johnson Controls for sponsoring this session. What opportunities for your community might COVID-19 leave behind? I would also like to thank Tanner from IT, who's our tech guru on this session. So thank you, Tanner. Your presenters have worked really hard at putting together valuable information to share with you today. And before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about each one of them, and so that you get to hear what great, awesome panelists you get to listen to today. Start with Jake Young. Jake is a certified urban planner and professional landscape architect. Jake leads big picture planning for the Salt Lake County Division of Planning and Transportation within the Office of Regional Development. Jake believes in creating healthy communities and vibrant economic centers. Peter Reichard has nearly 2 decades of experience in the public policy field. Prior to joining Utah Foundation in July of 2017, he spent 15 years as the research director at the Bureau of Governmental Research in New Orleans. He is the previous president of the Governmental Research Association, GRA, the National Organization of Governmental Research Professionals. He is the author or co-author of numerous national award-winning studies and has worked directly with local governments to bring land use reform efforts to fruition. Earlier in his career, Reichard was a journalist working as an editor at a major daily in the 1990s and as managing editor of the Business Weekly. He holds degrees from Loyola University and Fordham University. Last, we have Nikki Navio, and she is a transportation planner at the Wasatch Front Regional Council, where her days are dedicated to working with communities and alongside partners to develop the regional transportation plan for the Wasatch Front. Prior to her current role at WFRC, Nikki worked at HDR in Denver, Colorado, where she analyzed a broad range of transportation projects and their impacts, particularly to environmental justice communities. Nikki holds a bachelor's degree from University, and I just lost all that stuff, from Alaska. Okay, so Jake, Nikki, and Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. So as a side note, before we get started, please leave any questions in the chat box and we'll answer them as each presenter finishes their piece. There will be a portion of this presentation where we will ask for your feedback, and at that time, if you want to contribute, please use the raise your hand button in the chat box and we'll unmute you individually. Before I turn the time over to the presenters, we're going to run a quick poll to find out who's joining us today. So if you would just go ahead and click on each one of those buttons, that would be great. So it looks like we have a lot of great people joining us today. We've got Councilmember White from Ogden City. Thank you so much for joining us, Councilmember. We have got Andrew Gruber, the Executive Director with Wasatch Front Regional Council. Looks like we've got Evan Curtis from the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, and the list goes on. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you presenters. I'm gonna go ahead and turn the time over to Jake. Go ahead and get started.
All right, great, thank you. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and do a screen share. And give me just a second here. And are you seeing the slides on the side?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. Great. Well, we have a really fun topic. It's really kind of deep and profound. We put a lot of effort into discussing the nature of the topic. This comes from the analytics group that's led by the Wasatch Front Regional Council. We've had a lot of input from it. Evan Curtis, Ted Knowlton, Nikki and Peter and others participated in the discussion of this material. And the topic is, what opportunities for your community might COVID-19 leave behind? And as we begin, I'd like to mention the relevance of this to the Wasatch Choice 2050 plan. We believe that the Wasatch Choice Plan will help bridge us the future, bring us into the future. Some of the main topics of the Wasatch Choice Plan and the goals are provide transportation choices, support housing options, preserve open space, and link economic development with transportation and housing decisions. And you'll see the influence of the Wasatch Choice as we present and talk about this. And of course, having our own WFRC expert, Nikki, on our panelists, we're excited about that. So a little bit of the nature of this discussion kind of germinated from just a class I had in graduate school. It was called Fluvial Geomorphology, which I barely learned what that even means. And that's the study of the form and function of streams and the interaction between streams and the landscape around them. It's really about the nature and the science of how streams are created. And you're probably wondering, why in the world does this have to do with COVID? Well, one of the big things about fluvial geomorphology is that when you get a major event or a storm, that changes the stream and floodplain dramatically. More can happen in a big storm than you'll see over tens of years or hundreds of years with streams and rivers. And I'm just going to give you one example. I haven't rafted this myself, but I'd like to in the future. This is Crystal Rapids. It's on the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. And in 1966, there was a major storm that hit the Colorado River, the North Rim in particular, and 14 inches of rain dropped within a 24-hour period. And all that rain sent a lot of boulders down and debris and material down into the Grand Canyon. And what was a little bit of a riffle became a major rapid. And then in 1983, when we had all of that snow and rain and they opened up the Glen Canyon Dam and the floods kind of came through the Grand Canyon, that became very treacherous. And to this day, Crystal Rapids is talked about as the major rapid of the Grand Canyon, or one of them. And I link that with saying, okay, what is this big event that's happened with COVID? What is it doing with us? Here's some examples from our lifetime that I can bring up. Is sometimes we talk about pre 9/11 and post 9/11. We talk about pre-Great Recession. What was the housing market like? What were loans like before the recession? And then post-Great Recession, what we've been dealing with the last 10 years. And now we're starting to hear the talk about pre-COVID-19 and post-COVID-19. And Peter is going to talk a little bit about his experience with pre-Katrina and post-Katrina, with him living through that in person in New Orleans. So I'm really excited to think about, or to hear about that. So this gives you a direction we're going. So I'd like to share this quote from Abraham Lincoln. If everyone is moving forward together, then success takes care of itself. And that's our big message today, is that as cities and towns and regional planners and others, if we keep moving forward together with the Wasatch Choice, with our housing plans, our transportation plans, we pivot together, we work together, we can get through this. We've come through a lot this year, but we still have a lot to overcome. And now is the time to keep moving forward and acting and not letting COVID cause us to pause or wait.
Okay, well, I will stop your screen share and start mine. See how this works.
And while we're waiting for Peter to get his screen up and going, I just wanted to follow up on Nikki's bio. I apologize, my screen went blank right when I got to her qualifications. So Nikki holds a bachelor's degree from University of Alaska Fairbanks and a master's degree in city and regional planning from Clemson University. So Nikki, I apologize that happened, but we're so happy that you're here. Thank you.
Okay, looks like I have too many windows up, so let me close some so I can find what I'm looking for. All right, I suppose that is it. Okay, y'all seeing that okay? Okay. Not if you can hear me okay and you're seeing everything okay. Okay, thank you. If you don't mind, I would like to begin with just some general thoughts. First of all, I would say, along the lines of what Jake was just saying about working together, we should take heart while certain industries and businesses have been hit hard by this crisis. Utah has fared perhaps better than any other state in the country. Second, every major crisis brings opportunities and consequences, and regardless of the balance between opportunity and consequence, every major crisis brings major change. How we wrestle, that becomes the key. We are, as Jake alluded to, we're at a dividing line in our history. Looking ahead, we will define time in pre-coronavirus and post-coronavirus categories. Jake mentioned, he asked me to talk a little bit about this, that, having lived through Katrina in New Orleans and spending years doing work around recovery thereafter. By certain measures, New Orleans is stronger than ever. By others, such as population total, it remains far from recovering. There were major opportunities citizens seized, rebuilding their neighborhoods better than ever in some cases. That photo there is of the neighborhood I grew up in. This is the hardest hit neighborhoods in New Orleans were these middle class type neighborhoods. This is because they were built during the post-World War II period. It was slab on grade construction in the remaining land, which was up to 8 feet below sea level. In short, they were built in ways and in areas that people before World War II never would have considered viable. And it turns out they weren't viable. Today, my old neighborhood is in many ways unrecognizable, but it has been replaced by nicer homes built at higher elevations and surrounded by better engineered levees. Along with neighborhood improvements and a better federal levee system, there were significant reforms to address corruption, waste, and bad planning that my organization down there helped with. But there were also major opportunities that the governments of the city and the state squandered. For instance, they failed to address the fundamental infrastructure deficiencies that hold back the city's future prospects, particularly drainage. New Orleans mostly squandered opportunities to reorganize to make its government structures more effective. As a result, it remains a poorly run city. And 15 years after the Katrina disaster, the population is still only at 3/4 of what it was when the levees broke. Now, I'm going to sound a generally optimistic note today, but we can't forget the human cost of a major crisis such as the current one. When the levees broke in New Orleans, my grandmother's house, which was about a mile away from where this picture was taken, was inundated and she was evacuated to Texas. And the strain of that quickly destroyed her health and she died in a little town near Dallas. I never saw her again. In the months after that, amidst all the wreckage, I saw people's mental health shattered. I saw people self-medicate by turning to the bottle, and I saw marriages fall apart. We are seeing similar things now in this country. We're in a moment when countless people are in the midst of upheaval. So as we look to make lemonade out of lemons, let's not lose sight of the fact that the current economic crisis has destroyed many people's dreams and sense of well-being, and there will be consequences to that. And I should note here too that my focus will be on telework, but let's keep in mind that there's a large chunk of the population that doesn't have that option. So here are the questions we need to keep at the top of our minds as we move through this crisis. What are the opportunities our governments need to seize and not squander? And what are the negative consequences that we need to take strident action to minimize? How do we best play the hand that we're being dealt? To be sure, this has been a time of major change as we shift to more online working, online shopping, online learning, online governing, online healthcare, online business transactions, and even online recreation. Think about that you used to go to the movies and now you watch movies at home. From a public policy standpoint, all these changes will create some major issues we need to come to grips with. For instance, retail will never be the same. Online sales have grabbed a bigger share of the pie than ever before, and at least a few small businesses are disappearing and will never come back. I know Jake will have more to say about this, but we need to ask the question, what impacts will the shifts in consumer habits mean for land use policy? What about local revenue strategies? What about quality of life in our local communities where small businesses are part of the charm factor and provide amenities? What about the way government is administered? To take one example, I was recently talking with a local procurement official who told me her city has moved entirely to an online system with digital signatures. What other government activities and services should we be looking to make virtual? And how might these changes make government more effective and efficient and more responsive to the needs of citizens? From my perspective, probably the most significant shift is to online working. Roughly 1/3 of Americans are now working from home. It's important to remember here that people are creatures of habit. People across the planet are moving through various degrees of psychological change. It could be as radical as the way they view themselves, their future, and the world around them, or more universally involves changes in habit. People are getting in the habit of buying more things online, even their groceries. They're getting in the habit of eating takeout rather than dining in. As Nikki will discuss, they're getting in the habit of hiking and biking more. They're getting in the habit of watching new movies online rather than going out to theaters. And many people are getting in the habit of waking up in the morning and instead of climbing into a car and commuting 10 miles to an office, they're walking 10 feet to the home office and turning on the computer. At times when they do get into environments with other people, they're getting into the habit of social distancing. And I'm pretty sure that even after the current health crisis has passed, people won't be hugging their coworkers. They will want distance either through telework or in the workspace. Now, just as an aside here, it would be, I think, probably silly for us to completely ignore the voices out there that are predicting a flight from residential high density. I think this is a legitimate question to ask, whether our new consciousness of social distancing will translate into a kind of longer term hypochondria where people will begin to have an aversion to living in close proximity to neighbors. Some observers out there seem to think so. Now, you might say, I found this study or that study that shows that this is irrational, but we're not a nation of Spocks. Residential market decisions often involve gut and emotion. With that said, I just saw an article in the Washington Post, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, lauding a, quote, large-scale collapse in property values as being a good thing for cities like New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Los Angeles, Boston, Miami, Washington, because it will make those cities more affordable. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking that this rosy view perhaps does not take into account the effects of property tax revenues, tax rates, and the ability of these cities to maintain service levels and infrastructure if they lose property value. Anyway, regardless of fears of density, teleworking is opening up residential options for people. Let's keep in mind the example of New York City, where I myself once lived. I can attest that there are some people that live there because of their career, but don't particularly like the intensity of the place. You think about the people that try to escape to the Hamptons or wherever for the weekend, the ones that with the means of doing so. Well, teleworking now allows those people to live somewhere else entirely. At any rate, Utahns are getting in the habit of teleworking, and they appear to like it. A recent UCare survey showed a dramatic increase in the percentage of employers and employees with a positive attitude toward teleworking. And employees have good reason to like it. It all comes down to a simple phrase: quality of life. Few people enjoy their daily commute. They may now see the 45 minutes or the hour they spend commuting every day as a waste of time. When they were commuting, they spent more money on gas, parking, lunch. They spent less time with their families and engaging in their favorite pastimes. By teleworking, they may have opportunities to find better housing at a lower cost in a preferred environment. However, this raises the specter of sprawl on the urban fringe. We know a chunk of the population will rush to live on the edge of their commute if their commute time allows it. What if the commute time drops to zero? It will also be interesting to see over the long term the health effects. Will less time behind the wheel of a car translate into more time engaged in active transportation? Or will we have an outbreak of obesity as people have access to their pantries all day? From the employer standpoint, teleworking so far appears to be a win. Employers report higher productivity from employees, and lower expenses for travel, supplies, utilities, and meals. In the long term, many are likely to see reduced costs for office space as they move to partially or fully virtual offices permanently. And as anyone in budgeting knows, once you cut a line item like travel from the budget, it's hard to restore that funding, meaning that there will be long-term impacts. By the way, whether employers like telework or not, they better get used to it. Look at this graphic here. Millions of workers will now expect telework as a benefit of employment in many jobs, and they will start turning down offers that don't include telework as an option. But let's not forget that there are losers in this equation. The commercial real estate industry, which is already taking a hit on the retail side, will see a slowdown in office market growth. However, this may be partially made up on the warehousing side as e-commerce continues its rapid ascent. And another counterweight might be the need for bigger office spaces. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that habit of social distancing will stick to some degree, and office environments that place employees together in close proximity will probably be frowned upon. For those who do maintain offices, you might expect more space per employee. Offices might also be more like workstations where employees cycle in and out as needed, working from home on the out days. On the public policy front, there are several positives and negatives for planners and public officials to consider. And I guess we can even consider these as questions for the group to discuss. On the positive side, does teleworking mean less congestion? Buying more time for policymakers to address traffic capacity issues? To what extent does teleworking help with air quality issues? Utah Foundation is actually working on a report and we'll be addressing that in the next couple of months. Does more teleworking bring economic development to rural communities and small towns that currently lack robust employment opportunities? How much can local government save on office space and other facilities by having public employees telework? Are certain communities, due to maybe their their real estate mix or their population, are they in a particular position to benefit from the shifts now occurring? On the negative side, does more telecommuting encourage sprawl? What would be the impact on the tax base with fewer employees working in commercial centers, whether in the form of reduced sales tax from those hubs or in reduced property tax growth from offices and ancillary businesses? What will be the quality of life impacts from businesses closing as a result of changes in commuter and consumer activity? What are the social and economic impacts for communities with a higher dependent on hospitality and tourism or other hard-hit industries? Will the aversion to density discussed in some cities nationally have any impact on land use decision-making in fast-growing Utah? I think the jury's very much out on that. Are certain communities, due to their real estate mix or population, particularly vulnerable to the shifts now occurring. So we could go on, certainly, but I'll leave it at that. And I think, Jake, you wanted to take some questions right now? First round of questions.
Yeah, does anybody have questions for Peter while we're on the topic of telework? We'll also do questions at the end as well, but we like the idea of answering questions as we go too, pausing.
Yeah, thank you, Jake and Peter. Both of those presentations were great. Thank you so much. And at this time, we did get an email or a question from Jarrett Waite, and it says, how does teleworking affect electric usage in a home?
It's a good question. And I wish I could answer that for you right now, but I will be able to answer that for you in a month or two when our study is done. So we'll be looking at all of those, trying to figure out what the balance is of all of that. You know, whether, how does that net out? Do we end up with less energy usage consumption overall? But that's a good question. I'm just not in a position to answer that yet.
Thank you, Jarrett, and thank you, Peter. Are there any other questions before we move on to Nikki? All right, we did get a couple more questions. So from Mayor Hale, some developers are constructing residential near commercial developments so that the business in the development are not, quote unquote, Amazoned out of business. We also have a question from Suzanne Elger. How will lack of internet access discourage telework in rural areas?
Yeah, I think this is something we've been looking at quite a bit over the past several months. You know, are there opportunities to step up efforts to make sure that we are pushing out that broadband access, for instance, when we're building highways? And I know that's UDOT has been working on that for I want to say 10 years, if I remember correctly. So it's been a priority of theirs for some time. I'm interested in knowing how we're doing on that front compared to other states. And but my overall impression is that Utah has been fairly aggressive on that front, and certainly it is critical to those economic development benefits that some of these communities are hoping to pull from the telework change. Obviously, if you don't have access to a certain number of megabytes per second, if that's the metric, what is it, 100 plus, then your ability to participate in something like this even could be impaired. So that's going to be critical for those communities.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments before we move on? Okay, we'll turn the time over to Nikki.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Peter. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see?
Yes.
Great. Okay. How does that look?
Good.
Looks great.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks, Peter. I think, you know, the topic of telecommuting really segues into, as you mentioned, the transportation piece of the conversation. So when we're talking about reimagining our communities and what we want in them, transportation is really plays a key role in this. So today, I'd really like to share some of the trends and the data that we're tracking at WFRC with our partners at UDOT and UTA, and I'll just go ahead and jump right in. So as Peter had mentioned, there's really no surprise that we're seeing more people now than ever before staying at home. This graph is from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, and it's it's a general trend of what we're seeing in Utah, where pre-pandemic we had less people staying at home and working from home. And we saw a huge jump of that during the rise of COVID-19. And as places have opened over time, we're seeing it subside, but also higher levels of people still working from home now than in the past. We're also seeing that the total number of trips per day in Utah have gone down. So prior to COVID, we had, approximately 14 million trips in total that people were taking across the state. And you're seeing this significantly go down to about 10 million trips per day, which is, that's pretty significant, with a third down of what our normal levels are typically. So I just wanted to talk today about these trips, because how does this actually translate to what we think of when we're thinking about our transportation modes that we're making and this transportation system that we have, and how does this specifically translate to our to active transportation, transit, and also our roads and streets. So we'll look at some of the data by mode. The pandemic conditions have actually been a boom, if many of you have noticed, for cycling, not just locally, but everywhere. We've seen bike sales just go out the door. The demands of sales were up 75% and have gone up the most in ever history for the bike industry. So we're seeing more people on bikes, more so than ever. And in counts from local bike trails, we've seen the numbers double in usage from April and May of this year versus the same time frame around last year. In terms of what that specific data is, as I mentioned, we've looked at some Strava data on bicycle trips, and what we're seeing is that there's been an increase of over 50% from year over year for bike trips around Utah. And especially in the month of April and May, we saw an 80 to 90% increase. This is kind of leveled out, as you see in the June through August timeframe, especially with the hotter weather, but we're still expecting that these bike trips will increase about 30% in the future to come. And Strava data, it's a small pool of people, but it's kind of like a canary in a coal mine in terms of the types of people that we're seeing and numbers. And the types of users are very broad that are actually participating in active transportation. One example I have in here is the Stay Safe and Stay Active program that Salt Lake City put in place earlier in the around the April timeframe. And this was looking at opening the streets for creating more room to have social distancing in place, so you can actually walk and bike with your with your families and friends. And this saw a huge draw from the community all throughout. And I think they've closed down some of the streets, but several have still been in place. In terms of transit, it's not surprising that we're seeing changes in ridership for transit systems here and across the country. This data is from earlier this month, and as you can see, transit is down in terms of the front runner, down 70% as it comparisons to the pre-COVID level. So that's very significant. And And you know, with FrontRunner catering to most of the commuters, this is very, very high. But however, when you look at the breakdowns for each of the transit options, you can see that bus route or fixed bus routes have actually gone down the least. And back in April, UTA had actually adjusted their transit system. So it had been adjusted to what the COVID levels were, but that the services have now been adjusted back to the 90% of what it was to before. So they've made the adjustments, and then they're also requiring a lot of new things on there, including, you know, having riders wear masks, having increased cleanings and sanitizing. And there's also an internal task force that's looking specifically at the recovery of transit from COVID. I will also note that UTA has also made adjustments based off of the services that they've seen being used the most. So in some cases, on some service lines that have higher services than pre-COVID levels, they've adjusted some of those. And it's also interesting, earlier this summer, UTA provided a ridership survey and came out with some of those results. As you can see here, 37% of those who ride public transportation still depend on transit and don't really have another alternative mode for transportation available to them. Many of the routes also on UTA's systems had strong peaks in the mornings and the evenings in the past, pre-COVID. What we're seeing now is that the ridership is actually more consistent throughout the day, with the mornings being the most common time that people actually ride. And you know, the least decrease that we're actually seeing in ridership is actually happening on Sundays, which indicates that those people that you know, most typically ride and rely on these transit services are still using it at this time. In terms of roadways, during the height of the pandemic, we did see a significant drop in use of our highway system. Here's a snapshot I wanted to share of the daily traffic volumes along I-15 in the Davis County area. And you can see here that during the April and May timeframe, we actually saw the volumes drop by 50%, which is very significant. But now, as we've opened up businesses and communities have opened up services, we've seen those kinds of levels kind of go back to those normal averages. In terms of what we're seeing, not just in the Wasatch Front, but also across the state, you're looking at, you know, we're looking at traffic volumes to recreation gateways, and we're seeing the same trend here. So here's an example of the daily traffic volumes down in Zion up above, and the daily traffic volumes for Moab. And you can see on SR9 and Highway 191, people, you know, there was a huge drop, especially during the peak of when this is like, these are the peak typical times that people travel to these recreation sites. And then now we're seeing it kind of go back up. So it'll actually be interesting to see this fall, especially with people less keen on flying and driving more, as we've seen. You know, if they're less keen on flying, riding planes, you know, taking transit, will we actually see more people flock to these areas, especially more local and regional visitors? So going back more broadly, when we're looking at general trip trends in Utah, like I mentioned, you're seeing that people are traveling less on average, and when you're comparing the most recent data versus a year ago. And when people are actually choosing to leave their homes, they're sticking a lot closer to their neighborhoods. As you can see here, the average trips that are less than 3 miles or less than a mile have gone up, and these are not to scale, so I will note that, but I will go ahead and look at the next example. We'll just pick on Davis County here. But you can see the number of trips have seen not as much of a drop off, especially for those trips that are a lot closer to home. So in summary, what does this look like? We're seeing significant drop in transit, and bike trips are up all throughout. Freeway volumes are just about constant, even though there's less people traveling. And when people do travel, it seems like they're choosing to go in their cars more. And then more people, workplace trips have gone down, and retail trips have gone down, but not, it's basically rebounded. So this means that most people are choosing to spend time, and we're also seeing that most people are choosing to spend time near or close to home. So the really critical piece of this is that having transportation options to those nearby grocery stores, retail places, shops, parks are going to be really critical, because this localization of activity doesn't seem like it's going to go away anytime soon, especially when people are working from home and they have the option to stay and not have to commute. And as Jake had mentioned earlier, the Wasatch Choice vision, the vision that all our communities share for transportation investments and development patterns and economic opportunities, this is really built on these 4 strategies that we've identified. And communities already have developed great plans in place. I think that with the disruptions that we're seeing right now, especially with COVID, it's also a really good time to reflect and look at the great plans that we already have to actually think about long-term recovery and how we can enhance that long-term resiliency. So the biggest winner that we've seen out of all of this is really active transportation, and how we harness the benefits of active transportation from COVID is really going to be important, especially while transit systems are taking time and working really hard to lure back and bring riders to transit, and as businesses and workplaces are adjusting how they're going to deal with the telecommuting and see how the shifts in patterns and movements are of people. So this high comfort bike network is going to be key, and will also help build on what we've seen on the ridership increases. And many of these facilities already exist in the Wasatch Front and are planned as part of the Regional Transportation Plan and the Wasatch Choice Regional Vision. WFRC also recently developed an interactive map of active transportation data resources to help local communities. So this is one tool that local communities have, which can help identify some of those areas in your communities that might benefit from AT projects, see where different bike and pedestrian demand might exist on the bike network, see where the gaps might be. And you can also, we've also been tracking the funding and completion of different active transportation plans in the communities. So there's a wealth of resources on here if you go to WFRC.org. And so with the transportation component of Wasatch Choice being the Regional Transportation Plan, we're actually in the process of developing the 2023 to 2050 RTP. And the main initiative that we're really looking at and exploring this next year is going to be elevating the roles and impacts of external forces and policies. So these external forces are really looking at, you know, things that affect people's lives, as well as how households and firms exist, and how transportation, how we can use transportation to help support some of our communities in these cases. So, you know, naturally, COVID is one of those areas that we've been looking closely at, but we're also looking at things like automation, connected autonomous vehicles, high-tech transit systems, shared mobility. So this is looking at on-demand travel and sharing services and e-living. So the e-commerce and the telecommuting. And you know, these forces, I will say, were refined through the peer group meetings that we had actually earlier this summer with different city and county transportation agencies and local staff, as well as stakeholders from all across the state. And it's really it's an effort that we're really elevating through a unified effort from the Utah Department of Transportation, the Utah Transit Authority, and other MPOs. So it's not just a Wasatch Front effort. This is really looking at you know, all these different forces, including COVID, as part of how we can understand how they might shape our communities. So by understanding a lot these, like the effects of all these forces, of the pandemic and everything, we can have better informed local planning efforts. And last of all, have a couple questions here, but we just love to hear from local communities on your thoughts of how, you know, COVID is affecting transportation and land use shifts now, and what you think, you know, what changes you're planning to make, as well as what are some tools that communities might need to be successful. So we want to have these conversations together, and we're happy to do so. That's all I have for today, but thank you.
Great
Questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nikki. That was really good information. We do have a question from Andrew Gruber. He says, great information. Question for all panelists. What do you think are the relative roles of the public and private sectors to work to adjust these potential long-term impacts of COVID? How can the public and private sectors work together? Jake, Nikki, do you guys want to take a stab at that?
As part of my presentation, I'll be discussing public and private for the retail and also the housing. So I can address part of that. Nikki, do you have something right now on transportation you'd like to add?
Yeah, it's not so much, I guess it's dealing with local delivery, but you know, one of the things that we're looking at in terms of the demand for local delivery increasing now is developing a stakeholder group with businesses that are involved in the warehousing industry. So like the local freight centers, and really trying to understand some of those issues that some of these places are seeing, especially with the rise of the demand for warehousing and the local impacts of delivery there.
Yeah, I drove by the Amazon facility by the airport this week, actually last week, and I was blown away. The parking lot was full, and of course they were employees. They were there at the main warehouse, and all of the warehouses in that area where your guys' office used to be, absolutely full, very much working. I certainly see that private transportation sector needing to work closely with government for freight, especially with inland port coming and growing. I mean, it's here, but growing.
Right, especially with COVID, you know, it's really exacerbated that demand for internet shopping and all the other things that are related to it.
Great. Well,
Okay.
thank you both so much. We'll go ahead then and hold on to that question until your next presentation, Jake. And unfortunately, Peter has lost his connection, so he's working to reconnect at the moment. But Jake will turn the time, unless anyone else has any other questions. I don't see any questions in the chat box. Are there any other questions for Nikki before we move on? Okay, seeing none, we'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Jake.
All right, great, thank you. We're going to talk a little bit about housing, and then also we will be talking about retail and centers and commercial areas. And if you think about the impact of COVID-19, the health impact that was first and foremost being concerned about our community health and our family and our personal health. But then, secondly, it hit the telework, just as Peter was talking, dramatic changes in home and office and school, and then also transportation. Housing was hit a little bit later on. Thanks to the CARE Act, obviously there was money for people to pay rent or mortgages, and so there wasn't that impact right away, but certainly there have been impacts to the housing market, and I want to go over some of that. We've seen some dramatic increases in home prices this year. And of course, Utah for the last decade has had this strong increase in housing costs, but even more so just in the last few months from COVID. So our year-to-date price increase for homes for sale has been 7.9% increase. That's up dramatically. You'll see this price from 2019 is $315 on average, and then year to date is $340,000 for a home for sale. And this is Utah wide. These are average numbers across the board for the entire state. The year over year average, comparing July 2019 to July 2020, has been a 10% increase. Very significant price increases on homes. This was recently released by Cam Gardner Policy Institute. Right now, Utah ranks number 4 in terms of housing cost change index. Looking at multiple factors, bringing that into an index, and you see Utah is number 4 there. Comparing first quarter 2015 to first quarter 2020. Last 5 years were the 4th highest in terms of housing cost increase. That's very dramatic. You see that there with the 52%. If we were all here together, I'd like to see a show of hands. Well, actually, I wouldn't ask for a show of hands on this, but you could just ask yourself, has my income gone up 50% in the last year or last 5 years? And certainly across the board, we know that incomes have not gone up this way. And that's a big problem when we start to see incomes not keeping up with the housing increase. There are a lot of reasons why the cost of housing has gone up, in particular, new housing. This was I reached out to some builders and some developers I know, and one of them sent me this survey that was done. A significant increase in the cost of materials right now. Lumber, windows, doors, roofing, siding, and trim has gone up. And maybe you saw this in the news. Lumber's gone up 160% since April. On a new home that comes out to anywhere from $14,000 to $16,000 per average on a new home. That is a dramatic increase in terms of cost of housing just on a new home, just for lumber alone, not including all those other factors we've talked about. So I took a look at the building permits to see how they look during this COVID period of the data that's available. And you'll see this scale going back to 2013 to 2020, we're really closely on par with building permits. Very similar to 2019 numbers, a little bit less than 2018, but in terms of overall building permits, we are keeping track. But hold on a second before you get too comfortable. Also looking at the number of units, and the difference is that an apartment building can be a single permit with multiple units. And this is where we have the big difference right now is that we have dropped down to 2018 numbers in terms of less units than the last couple years. And this is gonna affect our housing costs in the future. And this is gonna affect how we're responding to the housing gap, is that we are seeing this decrease. I reached out to a number of cities to ask them if they had challenges in terms of processing land use applications or processing building permits. Some cities said that they had some temporary hiccups they had to get through. Others said they already had online processes and they just kept moving forward. So kudos to all the cities that overcame that quickly, continue to work on processing those building permits and land use applications. But our demand continues to be greater than our supply. Also another graph from Kem Gardner Policy Institute, and you'll see here, so you look at the gray graph, and the gray is the new households every year, 2010 through 2019. Each year we see those new households formed in Utah, and the red are the new housing units. And you see this difference on the graph, especially in 2010, 2011, 2012. We were very much behind in terms of keeping up with the new household. And then for the first time in 2018 and 2019, we did have more housing units than households. And so we were making progress on that housing gap. But I think that when we start to look at the 2020 data after the year is done, we'll see that maybe we've fallen behind. But in some of my conversations with Kem Gardner Policy Institute and Jim Wood, he did say that there's a lot of big projects coming, and there may be some makeup in 2021. But again, we still are behind. And here you'll see the cumulative effect. Currently, we're at about 50,000 in terms of more households than housing units. And what does that look like? Well, it may be 2 or 3 families living together in a home that otherwise they would like to be spread out. It may be your adult children that are in their 20s and 30s living in your basement and they don't want to move out because rent is too expensive. Maybe college kids moving back home because they don't want to move out. There's just a lot of different situations what that looks like. But I think this is something important that we need to consider, that COVID is affecting the housing price increase and also the building industry as well. And so that's going to continue to push up our housing prices. Other trends include low mortgage rates. Interest rates are extremely low, and that causes a bidding war for buyers as they go to buy, knowing that they can purchase more home with less dollars, having a lower interest rate. So now I want to shift gears a little bit. Before we're talking about for sale homes and purchases, whether it was a townhome or a single family home or something like that. Now we're going to talk a little bit about rent, because that's extremely important as well. And in particular, I want to show you this graph is very interesting. So you'll see in the graph in the upper right corner there, this inverse effect that as vacancy goes down, the year-over-year cost of rent goes up. There's a direct inverse relationship that as we have less vacancy in the market, the cost of rent goes up and up. I know it's a very basic economics 101 information, but it still is very important that we need to remember that if there is not vacancy in the market, it's going to push pricing up. And so right now you'll see in the upper right corner that mid-2020, we are seeing pricing leveling out a little bit on rents. Look down here in this graph, the lower right corner, you'll see 2019 and 2020 in Salt Lake County, not a big difference. Now I do have 4 counties from the Wasatch Front, so I'm gonna go through those. Here's Utah County, and you'll see a little dip here, and you'll see a dip in overall average rent coming down in Utah County just a little bit. So the vacancy goes up, and then the pricing goes down just a little bit. Here is Davis County, which is not having the same trend as Utah County and Salt Lake County. You'll see there that the vacancy is going down and the pricing is going up still even currently in the 2020 market that we're seeing. And then here's Weber County, the last county from the CBRE data. And you'll see Weber County is also following the trend of Davis County, where the vacancy is still holding. We're not seeing a lot of vacancy, and so that price is continuing to go up also in Weber County. So very interesting how the for sale homes pricing has gone up dramatically, but also rent is still pushing up a little bit in some areas and coming down in some other areas. Here's some other threats to affordable housing, things to keep in mind. Income's not keeping up with housing increases, increase in permits and impact fees, land development costs, construction costs, including labor, land costs, topography of mountainous areas. Really, for the most part, the easier to develop areas of the Wasatch Front, the more flat, the gentle slopes, they've been built, they've been developed. And so as housing pushes up on the slopes or goes farther out, then that can be more expensive. Local zoning, ordinances, NIMBYism, that's part of the factor. Exceptional demographic and economic growth boosts on the market. We all know that our economy is holding on, that we don't have the same unemployment rates as other places, so that continues to boost growth. And then market conditions confirm the shortage. So with housing pricing going up almost 8%, what is your community doing about it? And if you'd like to put something in the chat, some things that you're working on in particular in your community, I think that would be great to hear. One thing that, as we're talking about housing, I do want to mention that we do have the moderate income housing plans. Almost every city and town across the state has a moderate income housing plan in place from the SB 34 bill that came out last year. This graph that you see before you is a little bit of research we did in our office. We looked at every moderate income housing plan in Utah to see which of the strategies were the most common of the 23 menu items. And so I'm going to list those off. Accessory dwelling units was the most popular, higher density and moderate income for commercial areas, higher density and moderate income near transit, and then also preserving moderate income. So with that, they keep moving forward with your housing plans. That's critically important. That's something that all cities need to do because that will help our entire state. So now I'm shifting a little bit to talk about retail and online. This was an interesting headline, A Tale of Two Pandemics. Big box stores rake in record profits while small businesses fold. It really is. And in some cases, it's great if you have stock in Home Depot or whoever, but also it's really hurting Main Street and our small businesses in our towns. And that's very critical. We need to look at that and talk about it. U.S. retail sales to drop more than 10% in 2020, just a national kind of e-commerce. So this next slide is very interesting, this data. So you see the blue line, that's the growth of online retail. This is nationwide. And you just see year over year, this gradual increase of online retail. And then bam, COVID hits, people are staying home and shopping online. And it's about a 35% increase that we've seen comparing second quarters of 2019 and 2020. Dramatic increase in online retail. This graph shows what it was predicted to be pre-COVID, and then what others have predicted it to be after COVID is kind of just the last few weeks. The green line is kind of the pre-COVID forecast, and the red line are updated forecasts, seeing that big spike in COVID-19 and then dropping down and continuing to increase in local retail. Here's some numbers just from some retailers. Target up 24%, Walmart 93%, Lowe's 157%. I don't know why people love Lowe's, but obviously they've done well. But now I want to talk just a little bit about the decrease in local retail. This article talked about more than 100,000 retail stores could close by 2025, accelerated by 2019, actually accelerated by COVID-19. So this graph shows you that the dollars that local retail is getting per square foot is going down. In 2014, averaging about $396 per square foot. That was 2014. In 2019, averaging $382 per square foot, and then also a big decrease by 2020 at $338 per square foot. So those local stores are seeing less dollars go out because of the retail, and that is affecting all of us. I think we're seeing this across the entire Wasatch Front, and especially in the small towns and rural Utah as well. So some people may be wondering, will Main Street die, or is this doom and gloom? And I say absolutely not. I think it's time to reinvent Main Street. It's time to reinvent our downtowns and our mixed use areas, use the good ideas we've had in the past and our plans, and do something a little bit different. Here was a recent survey asking about what people miss about going out, and I thought this was really interesting. So what do you miss about visiting shopping malls or just going out and shopping? The number one was social interaction. 79% of survey participants said they miss seeing their friends and their family and just being out together. The second one here, having a morning or a day or afternoon out, 62%. And then other ideas, finding new products, things that you just see by browsing at the stores, asking advice to a retailer, an ability to see and feel products and look at that. I know if you're buying a bike, like Nikki talked about with bike sales happening, it's nice to take that bike for a test ride. And of course, you can't do that online. But as you look at this survey results, you see that the ones at the top, these are things that you cannot get online. That social interaction, being out of the house, being outside, having dinner at a cafe or something like that. I think people are always going to want that, and there's always going to be a market and a demand for that. So as the nature of retail changes, what is your community doing about it? Is it going to look like the retail of the 90s or the 2010s, or is it going to look something different? Here's some considerations. I want to give you 5 considerations for changes in physical retail planning. One is assist small businesses with websites so they can be online and physical. A lot of businesses that are successful have gone to a hybrid of offering for sale products online and also having a physical store. Rezone commercial only areas to add housing and become mixed use. We do have a lot of those strip malls, those old Kmart's or whatever ones, big box that have closed down. It's time to rezone those areas. Increase the quality of experience for shopping and dining. I'll talk about that in a second. Reduce parking requirements or repurpose some of the parking spaces. I know some of the cities in Salt Lake County have rezoned some of their areas so that developers can come in and add housing in some of those unused parking areas. And then number 5 here, follow your general plan. I'm sure there's a lot of good suggestions in there, and that's a long-range planning document that should help you. So getting back to a topic or a point I previously mentioned, give people a place worthy of shopping, dining, and work. We need to produce environments that give people a reason to get out. If I can sit at home on my couch and I can order Domino's pizza and I can order my clothes on Amazon and get everything I need and telework at home, why do I need to go out? Well, I think this is where cities and developers and retailers and planners and designers need to work together and say, let's give people a reason to get outside, to go shopping and dining and have a place to gather. And so that's something that I encourage all cities to really be working on. This is the last slide, and then we can open up for discussion. We shared this quote before, Abraham Lincoln: if everyone is moving forward together, then success takes care of itself. And I really want to emphasize the moving together. This is where cities are working together internally, cities are working with cities are working with developers and designers, reaching out to the public for input, and really that collaboration and moving forward. So that's the end of my presentation, and we can go to questions for myself or to our other panelists.
Great, thank you, Jake. And yeah, before we conclude, are there any other questions for Nikki or for Jake that you guys would like to ask? I don't currently see any in the chat box, but if you do have any, I know that we are right on time with our 2:15 time. So if you have any, please send those over. And then just as a quick reminder, you know, there have been a lot of really good graphs and charts and information shared during this session. So some of you may want to go back and look back on these, and remember that all of these sessions are being recorded and that you can access all of these after the conference has finished. So I don't see any questions. And Alex, no, Peter has not been able to join us, unfortunately. If you'd like to shoot me an email, I can share his contact information with you. And then, you know, if you have any questions for Peter, he would be happy to answer those.
Peter sent me a text, and because he was speaking out in favor of telework, that the online gremlins came for him, is what he said. So, Katie, you've done such an excellent job in hosting this. Thank you to you and W4C and the league for really managing this. Shifting an in-person conference to an online is an incredible amount of work.
Well, thank you so much, Jake, and thank you, Nikki and Peter. You know, you guys have all done a great job putting this session together, and thank you to all of the attendees for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you again throughout the conference sessions, and our time is up. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day.